thank you everybody who joined us today from many different time zones. I see folks who have joined us perhaps for the first time in our weekly webinars. If this is your first webinar, welcome and please come back. We have a large group today, actually, not only diverse from different countries and time zones, but also all kinds of colleagues from different institutions around the world. And I think it's because of the topic and the speakers that we have today. The topic of research and publishing in scholarly outlets is always interesting. Obviously, this is something we cherish as part of our profession, teaching and research, and try to get better and better. It's always a work in progress. There's a lot we can learn from the masters, and we have a couple of masters with us today, a couple of very seasoned publishers, accomplished scholars, and also journal editors. But the list goes on, list of their accomplishments. Both Saeed and Costa, they're also great mentors. They mentored a lot of faculty and doctoral students over time. And I know for a fact they are also very, very dedicated reviewers. I've seen their work. They take real interest, and if the paper is a good one, they invest in the paper along with the authors. So we're very pleased to have you today, Saeed and Costa. I'm going to apologize up front. I'm not going to provide a lengthy introduction or biographies for you because you are well known to this particular audience today. You're accomplished publishers, scholars, editors. Saeed, of course, you are a chaired professor at the University of Tulsa, and you serve on JIBS and as an editor, as well as other journals like Journal of International Marketing, as well as marketing journals. And Costa, of course, you've done the same thing. Most recently, you edited Journal of International Marketing, editor-in-chief for 2 terms. Now you're an editor with the Journal of International Business Studies, and I believe other journals such as the Journal of Academy of Marketing Science and so on. So today, we would like to have a bit of a conversation with these folks. And of course, you know, I've had my share in terms of publishing and also editing and leading and mentoring young colleagues as well. We'd like to share with you, first of all, a set of comments that focus on initially what it takes to be successful in scholarly publications. We will reflect on our own journeys and give you some personal insights. Then we'll turn to common reasons why papers are turned down, are rejected by, because that's always a good lesson. We'll take a look at a list of such reasons that we tend to see from reviewers and ways in which we can respond to those limitations. Then we'll talk about key ingredients of publishable papers. Each of us will comment on that. And then we'll talk about the crafting part itself, because successful publishing is both, I think, a combination of science and art as well. It certainly takes a lot of dedication, but it's a combination of improving and practicing. And with the practice, you get better and better. So the issue of crafting manuscripts, we'll talk a little bit about targeting journals, how to go about targeting journals, and we'll provide some final comments. And I know we're going to run out of time. So what we have done, we're going to try to leave about 10, 15 minutes for questions and remarks. But we also have prepared, each of us, handouts. I have a set of PowerPoints, a pretty lengthy set of PowerPoints I will not go through today. I will talk to you directly. I'll just share just a few slides. And Saeed and Costa also have put together a reading list that you will all get because you participated in this webinar. after the event, along with the recording of the session. So Saeed, welcome to you again. Great to have you here. And Costa from another time zone, welcome to you. I'll get started and then maybe turn to Saeed and then to Costa on sort of personal strategies and philosophies of getting published. Obviously, you get better at it, but it requires a lot of commitment, dedication, and a lot of practice. What I've tried to do is to keep it interesting for me. I mean, obviously, we have an interest to contribute to the advancement of knowledge and advancement of business practice as well. I had a very strong foot in the practice. I always got my ideas from business problems, business issues, compelling issues in the business executives' minds, what keeps them awake, and mega trends, major issues that take place in the global economy. And I try to stay on the forefront, on the cutting edge of business practice, because sometimes the topics and themes that we discuss in journals get overdone. I mean, so, one more paper may not make a big impact on taking the knowledge a step further. So I try to keep it interesting by varying the topics. If you look at my publishing history, you'll find that I started with exporting, then I moved to multinationals, I moved to born globals, I moved to B2B context and the international business relationships. We're looking at now rivalry between emerging market firms and multinational firms, and along the way, many different topics. You have to keep it interesting. Early on, if you are a young scholar, of course, I think it's very important for you to be dedicated to a particular stream of research, because it takes so much effort, so much time to really get to know the evolution of that stream of research, to be familiar with all the seminal pieces that have been published, so that you can appreciate what is the next step, what is the next big question in that particular stream of research where you can compare, where you can contribute. So we're talking about programmatic research, making sure that you have a specialty and expertise in certain fields and you build your brand. Initially, I think that's very important. Once you get over the hump, you're more experienced and published and you have your tenure, then you can splurge. You can be all over the place like I have been for a long time. But I also, one of the things I also do, I work with collaborators. 90% of my work is with my PhD students. And that's great satisfaction, gratification. So I tend to focus on things that interest them. Therefore, I think we motivate each other when you're working with collaborators, colleagues and students and so on. You certainly motivate each other, you help each other, you complement each other's strengths. I think that's also very, very important. I will share just one screen here with you in terms of one slide in terms of other important points too. So the point here, when we focus on research projects, you have the opportunity to start from a puzzle or a compelling question. I think this is very important. I always make sure that we have a real issue, substantive issue to deal with. So that usually comes from business practice to me. I keep up with the business publications, not just academic journals, such as McKinsey Quarterly or PwC's Strategy Plus Business, or just business publications themselves, because there's a lot of questions that you can pick up from there. About something in the literature that is unresolved, contradictory findings, a challenge, a new phenomenon can be the basis. Obviously, you have to also respond to these other issues, whether or not the particular topic you have is going to be explainable, whether the hypothesis or the arguments that you're making have a sound theoretical basis. And of course, data. If you're working on an empirical paper, data is very important. So these are also important issues. I'm going to stop sharing now. Whether or not you have a compelling topic or theme, a puzzle or unresolved issue, that is typically driven by managerial challenge. And then interesting theoretical motivators, hypotheses, and the opportunity to advance knowledge in novel ways. So what you're doing is new and novel, contributes to new disciplines. So let me just stop there and turn to Saeed and then Costa and hear a little bit about from them in terms of what worked well for them. Saeed?
Thank you, Taber, for those comments. And what I would like to do is take us to a slightly different angle and talk about the plans that we all need to put together to proceed with research. This is something that I think, to my way of thinking, actually very few people do this. Occasionally, maybe it's a mental model as opposed to a plan that you put on paper. But I think a short and long-term strategy for publishing is a key one. That we sort of have to have a mental model, actually a written model. What am I trying to accomplish? How am I going to publish? Where am I going to publish? How many pieces, and so on. And then in planning that, or making the plan, we have to take into account how much resources are available at your disposal. What kind of funds are available for data collection or for other tasks, or for purchasing databases as needed. Who are my research collaborators in-house at the institution where you work, that you're associated with, and what are my external networks? Other researchers, other leaders, perhaps in the field that can join me on this project. Or I can at least lean on them for assistance when the question comes up that I don't have an answer to. What kind of resources do I have? Then graduate assistants, whether or not you're at an institution with a doctoral program, all of these issues need to be taken into account to really put together a realistic plan. I don't think any of these actually closes the door, but it makes the plan more realistic. If you collaborate with external collaborators that have access to funds or have access to graduate assistants, you can modify some of those shortcomings by virtue of association with friends and colleagues that are in the same profession. Then you have to take into account the requirements, pre-tenure and post-tenure research requirements. What are there? Is there any number that you have to hit, and so on? And I think this is one of the best lessons that I got many years ago was from the late Stan Slater, who did a number of seminal pieces. Many of you may have heard of it on market orientation. And he was at Colorado State University, which is not a research one school, but it's a decent university. And he told me that he had to basically put things in perspective, that what are the things that he can do at a school that's not driven by research and necessarily the leading publications. And he did publish in the leading publications, but the frequency were fewer, and of course he didn't have a doctoral program, so that actually affected his productivity. In other words, his plan fit where he was, and that was the place he wanted to be at. But nevertheless, he made some major contributions to the marketing discipline. And I think this is really a good lesson for me, and I think it's hopefully a good lesson for everyone to take into account, what are the realistic views of where we are in terms of what we can accomplish, and what do we need to do to hit a high journal or a top level journal. The other thing to take into account is that when you plan, of course, all of us would like to publish in better journals. Publications is the currency of this profession in academia. And If that's accepted as the currency of the profession, then the journal quality is the exchange rate for the journal. So we really need to put that in perspective in terms of where we want to be, in terms of the resources available. Very few people actually repeatedly get hits in high-level journals, and everyone gets rejected from a variety of journals, but certainly from the top leading journal. In other words, rejection is the par for the course, and we learn through these rejections. There are increased submissions at the journals, and they receive, I think, just to look at the Journal of International Business Studies, which I'm an editor of, the 2020, I think, submissions, or at least the 2019 submissions, are approaching 1,000. And that's 1,000, and there are only 9 issues. Each issue has about somewhere between 6 and 8 public articles in it. So the number of acceptances, given the number of submissions, is low. Acceptance hovers around 6 to 8%, about 7%. Impact factor 9.9, over 9, basically, the most recent one, which is quite respectable. Just by virtue of those numbers, I'm not going to be able to hit that journal repeatedly time and again. I'm going to get some rejections from them. And so, maintaining a mindset of that is important. So a portfolio of articles is critical, to be realistic about that in terms of, how many in each of the journals. Keeping in mind that publishing the top journals is going to be difficult. There was a study done in 2006, published in the Journal of Marketing, about the rate of publications by approximately, I think this was based on data from 337 successful candidates at the top 70 institutions in the United States, in terms of how many publications per year at the leading institutions. And, from doctoral program to tenure, basically, that span, which is around 5 years, 6 years. And the annual average for the top 10 institutions was just under 0.6 per year, less than 1 per year for those candidates at the top 10 institutions. The next 30 institutions had under 0.5, less than half of an article in the leading journals. And the next 30, 40 to 70, had 0.26. So even at the leading institutions, where resources are ample and lots of collaborators, and there's a research drive that's going on, typically there's a doctoral program, publications per individual is not all that high. So we have to be realistic about where we can go with that. With that, I'm going to stop.
And I think, thank you, Said. Thank you, Said. And to do that, you need to really develop your own best practice too. Learn from the masters, but develop your own. And yes, the rejections are also useful. They help us, but you have to also have some successes along the way. You cannot just have rejection. That's very demoralizing. So it's perfectly fine to what I call sequencing submissions. So, if you're not having success with the A-level journal, go on to the B-level journal, get that published, move on to the next project. Keep a portfolio of projects, so like Said said, so you have some successes along the way to motivate you. With that, Costa, what really works for you? What has worked for you?
Thank you, Damer. Some points based on my own scholarly journey may include, of course, selecting a promising area. The relevance of the research topic is vitally important. The area should not be over-researched. On the other hand, it should not be so new and undefined, because we'll never be able to complete a project within a manageable time period. We need to undertake research that has impact. Impact not only for theory development, but also for business practice, public policy, or the society as a whole. Always I have tried to pursue theory-driven research. I mean, these days, especially, our theoretic research studies do not reach very far. Always I try to spot leaders in the area in which I pursued research. It's vitally important to draw from highly influential, the work of highly influential people, because when we submit a paper to a journal, I mean, it's likely that reviewers will be familiar with the situation. So we need to draw attention to important papers. And also what I found very important in my case is developing a research team. We need to build relationships with individuals to pursue research, individuals who have complementary skills. Nowadays, it's so difficult for an individual to do everything and publish in a tier 1 journal. And therefore, a group of people should join forces in order to target and deal with reviewers of leading journals. Now, an ideal model, I would say, for me is I kick off with a promising idea. My early research was on drivers of export performance. I started with exporting. I paid considerable attention to conceptual development, to conceptualize, for instance, export performance and its drivers. And then when I was developing a draft or the project and conceptual model, I was presenting my work to academic conferences and seminars so that I could get feedback with a view to improving my work. And then when I felt confident, I was pursuing the empirical studies. I was coming up with papers based upon the empirical work and the analysis which I did, and the focus of attention was for me to target scholarly academic journals. And when I completed a project, I started with the next one. In other words, I was involved in continuing conceptual development so that I could build on my next project from what I learned from the previous one. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn to the next question here and spend a little bit of time on why we see papers coming back to us from journals. Here I have a typical set of top reasons for rejection. This is based on my own experience, and I think Saeed and Costa will agree with these questions, with these reasons or rationale why papers tend to get turned down. And by the way, you will have access to all of these slides that I will share, 3 or 4 slides I'll share today, but many more after the event. When you look at this list, what strikes me is, number one, some of these things are our own fault. If we're getting a paper, number 10, for example, because it's their own journal, that means we didn't do our homework. We didn't study the particular journal, its editorial objectives, the kind of papers they published, empirical, theoretical, the length, the style. So these are some of the things you need to really take care of before you submit. Obviously, number 9, topic too trivial. Well, we didn't do a good job of marketing the importance, accentuating the importance of the topic. It was not a novel enough contribution. It was not a major or substantive contribution. So think about these. To me, though, the most typical, the one that always comes up is really number 3, inadequate conceptualization and theory. We get this often. I mean, I think most of you will agree with me. And like my colleague said here, we get rejections all the time too. And this is typical. So what do they mean by theory? And so here's what I will suggest, and I will not have time to talk about it in detail now, but in my PowerPoint slides, you'll see a 3-point template, 3-step template for incorporating theory into your empirical projects and research papers, where step number 1, you start with the claim, with the argument, you sell the topic, you have that puzzle, and then you do a lot of reading. You need to invest in reading. So there's no end to reading. And Costa talked about this too, especially those seminal pieces written by the thought leaders in that particular stream of research. You have to be thoroughly familiar so you can appreciate what is the next big question in that stream of research, and try to build your model. So whatever the question is, I mentioned we're looking at, with our doctoral students now, the rivalry between emerging market firms and multinational firms that come into those markets. So the question is, do multinational firms always prevail with their big global iconic brands, or do the local indigenous firms sometimes prevail in terms of market share gains? And we have historical data to work on this, and it's really fascinating. We have many explanations, but from these explanations comes an argument, a proposition, and a model, set of drivers, set of maybe mediating factors, and set of outcomes. So then you start thinking about the third stage actually is when you do this research and build your map of the literature on one sheet of paper, is, I will argue. The next step is to start thinking about particular theories that may help you rationalize, justify the relationships between the variables you have in the model. So that's the stage, I think. You don't necessarily start with a theory. In my own experience, you don't start with a theory. If you start with a theory, you have dead end. You start with a compelling question, argument, you look at the literature, you build your model, you try to, then you begin to explore some hypothesis, and then start thinking about which theory within the management discipline, business discipline, or outside in social sciences may help me justify these theories. So let me just share with you one more slide, where one of my colleagues looked at, in terms of theories, looked at the theories that are frequently used in the Journal of International Business in the last several years. This was a lot of work, but this is, I think, will be interesting to you, and you have this in your slide deck as well. So it's interesting to see, for example, the papers that get published in JIBS in recent years. The most common theory is institutional theory. So some 14% of the papers. This is a very comprehensive study this colleague did. Then you have RVB, organizational learning, social network theory, knowledge-based view, internationalization theory, and so on. But there's more at the bottom. And there's also others. The point here is that you really need to invest in understanding the assumptions, the arguments, and particular limitations of each theory, and under which context they may be applicable. So it's very important to make sure that you have, like Costa said and Saeed said, solid theoretical foundation, especially if you're publishing, trying to publish, aspiring to publish in top journals. This is a key. Number one reason that you'll see papers coming back will be limited theoretical foundations. So this is something that you need to, I think, incorporate. Saeed or Costa, if you want to make any comments on this, you are welcome. Otherwise, we'll go on to the next topic, which is key ingredients of publishable papers.
If I may, I'd like to add to what Thomas said, and I think his list of rejections, reasons for rejection, I think is an excellent one. It really is pretty much all inclusive. I don't have anything specific to add to that, except that most, and I think pretty much all journals have what's called desk rejects. And some of the items that you saw on the screen that Tamer showed, reasons for rejection, are really desk reject reasons. It's not that the paper goes through the review and so on and so forth. It's just that the editor simply would not waste his or her reviewer's time sending it out and gets desk rejected. If it's inappropriate for the journal, or if it really hasn't followed the journal style and it doesn't, the fit isn't very good, if it clearly has a flawed methodology or a poor theory that Tamer was stressing, or if the results really don't mean very much. So these are some of the basics that makes a desk reject. They were all included in that list, but there is a distinction. And this is not a minor issue, although we try obviously not to get this rejected, but this can happen, and it's the desk rejects that at different journals, depending on the policy, varies, and it can be as high as 50–60%. So it's not a minor thing. To be careful about that. And one of the things that I would just really to reinforce what's something that Tamer had said about the conceptual foundation of the paper. To my experience, most papers get rejected after the review, either 1 or 2 reviews, because the conceptual issue is not strong. The motivation for the study, the rationale is just not really there to go any further with it, and the conceptualization is not very strong. And it's not due to technical reasons. There could be technical reasons, but most of them, as I think Tamer said, is based on conceptual and theoretical issues. That is probably the #1 reason. With that, I'll stop. There are, of course, many other points that one could make, but let me just pass the.
Thank you, Said. Costa, if you want to comment a little bit on key ingredients of publishable papers. So obviously you are both editors. You've seen papers come in and go through the review process, only certain percentage survive. When you look at that certain percentage, what are some common features, common profile?
Always, it's vitally important for us to focus on interesting, timely research problems, if we can say so. I mean, research seen as uninteresting can be the most serious criticism against a manuscript. Of course, always we want to be in search of managerially relevant research on timely issues. We want to have conceptual and methodological rigor in our paper. I mean, we need to define the constructs as early as possible in the manuscript, and we want to have good quality data. Often simple, appropriate analysis would be fine. Of course, the issue of impact is very important, as mentioned, and always my thinking is that research has to have novel elements, needs to offer new conceptual thinking, needs to provide generalizable findings that add sufficient value or make a significant contribution to the body of existing knowledge, and of course, it is able to address current problems. Readability is always a key success factor in each and every manuscript. The way in which I classify in practical terms the elements of a publishable paper, I have 3 levels in which I consider this. The first set of elements are fundamental elements, are elements that each and every manuscript should have before we think about submit to a journal. We need to be able to specify clearly the gaps in the literature and contribution in a convincing positioning of our study. The theoretical interest in and the relevance of the research topic should be there. Conceptual and methodological rigor should be there. And at the end of the day, the paper should make a good discussion of theoretical and managerial implications. Now, if we want to elevate the quality of our research, our paper should consider moderating effects, perhaps cause and effect linkages through the use of a longitudinal study, or using objective performance data. If relevant, pay attention to common method bias. And also these days, what is very important is consideration of endogeneity. And if we want for our paper to target a leading journal, well, there we have to have an overarching theory-based conceptual framework, a conceptual story that can bring together the various parts of the model under the umbrella of a smooth story. Then the important issue is the significance of the contribution. For instance, introducing a new mechanism in order to explain connections between variables. For instance, we may do research in an area where there are mixed findings. Excuse me. In order to resolve these mixed findings, we may be able to come up with a new mechanism, a new variable, along with moderators that can explain the connections, or providing new evidence that runs contrary to established research. Or even another example would be to develop and test a model that integrates distinct and perhaps incommensurate theoretical perspectives. I mean, at the end of the day, the contribution to existing theoretical knowledge should be there, presented in a unique way, in a very well-crafted manuscript. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent again. Lots of good ideas there. I think certainly in terms of positioning the paper, I think you talked about the paper also needs to have a personality, clear personality in terms of what it's contributing to. Does it have a clear, non-ambiguous purpose? Is it empirical, methodological, conceptual, thought piece? Because it can be any one of these papers. So when the reader gets, the reviewer gets your paper, first few pages is very important, right? The abstract first few pages will sell the paper or will lose the interest of the reviewer. So you need to convince the reviewer that this is your objective. It's non-ambiguous, it's very clear, it's substantive, and it's intriguing in the sense that it's asking some questions that have not been addressed before. So does it fit nicely with the literature stream? Because you need to also tie it to a gap in the literature. And does it have a modest rather than ambitious promise? Sometimes we try to overly generate unrealistic expectations in the sense that we're promising too much. And the narrower the paper, the more successful you will be with your publishing. It should have a clear direction, clear set of questions. You should put them up front, remind the readers along the paper of how that is getting addressed, and then at the end come back and say that these were the questions I asked, this is how I addressed them. I think it needs to have a very modest contribution. Some of the ways in which you can enrich your model, because there's so much written. When you get into the literature stream, you will always find that, well, you're not the first one who's taught about that, right? I mean, so somebody else has had the same ideas, but you need to be able to contribute something new. So how do you do that? Perhaps some intriguing moderators, mediators, maybe more robust measures, and change in the context, because all of our knowledge in social sciences, international business is contextual, right? Everything is contingent upon. So contingent upon industry, contingent upon country setting, firm-based, unit of analysis, particular type of firms you sample, small, large, technology, non-technology. So you can change the context and still provide I think, a modest contribution to the literature. So new or novel contribution that my colleagues have talked about. You have to ask before you submit. Obviously, it's very important for you to have many, many friendly reviews of your papers. Somebody, a colleague, a collaborators, co-authors, certainly, but not necessarily your mom or your spouse. Ask these questions before you submit. Does the paper provide fresh insights, explanations? Does it crystallize thinking? Does it propose new constructs or conceptualization? Does it offer insightful prescription? Go through these questions and self-examine the novelty of the papers before you get the rejection. So the more iterations of the paper that you have worked on that satisfy you and satisfy your friendly reviewers, the better are the chances of getting an R&R, which is at the end of the day, that's all you can ask for, an R&R. Hardly do we see papers that get published the first time around. Typically once or twice they need to be revised. So coming back to this question, then we have very few minutes left, unfortunately. One of our participants is asking about targeting journals. Saeed and Costa, what is it that we need to know about journals and targeting and maybe sequencing our publications? Costa, do you want to go first?
Yes, thank you. We have to make very careful decisions about the journals we are targeting. First of all, we have to understand what counts at our institution. We don't want to go for journals that do not count at our institution, especially during the early stages of our careers. We need to avoid also targeting only leading journals, especially if your research does not have top-tier journal quality trappings. We need to think of how well our paper would fit in with the journal we are thinking about. We have to look at the journal's positioning, the objectives, and the guidelines for authors. But in more practical terms, what I have found helpful always is to look at recent issues of the journal and the articles published to see how papers are presented and structured, and more importantly, to identify the hot issues and current debates in the literature. Then we have to assess our paper and how it would contribute to these hot issues and debates that are taking place currently in the literature. And often what we see is, of course, rejections is in the rules of the game, but a category these days, which is coming along more and more, is that reject, resubmit. I found the hard way that when an editor tells me reject, resubmit, I should do it because the editor has seen something there that has got potential. And it is for us to sit down, to look at it strategically and see how we can augment our study and elevate the work so that we can go there and hopefully we'll see an R&R.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Saeed.
Yeah, I would just really echo what's already been said about what it takes to be in the top leading journals, and I think the term that always is in the back of my head in terms of what the editors are looking for, or the reviewers for that matter, is what they generally refer to as the aha moment. Is there some substantial addition to the existing knowledge? Is there a huge contribution through this paper? And if the contribution is not major, it's really not going to click that switch immediately. Maybe it takes a little bit of work. Maybe the piece just needs to be repositioned. But having really the right idea and making sure that the model or the paper is really groundbreaking in some way, that would be an eye opener, and I think that would make a big difference. I would go back and also sort of, you're hearing a lot of things that you're saying in different ways. Part of the positioning of the paper to make it stand out initially when it's viewed by the reviewers or by the editor is the title. I come across a range of titles, and some of them are so long that they try to really write an abstract through the title. But that's the brand for the paper. My background is marketing, so branding is really important. So when we come up with a title, that's the brand of the paper. Making sure that the brand is succinct and short, but then it's also inviting and gets you into the paper. And as Thomas suggested a moment ago, make sure that within the first couple of pages that you make a compelling case for the study, not just in terms of gap in the literature, but to me, what really would stand out is something that I think we have all echoed, and that's the relevance of the paper. How meaningful is the result of this investigation? Where can we go with this? So I think those are going to play big roles for me. Does it make sense in a business context? Is this something that the businesses can actually deal with? I think we refer to it as the managerial relevance, managerial implications. And that's something that we don't really, a lot of people, including myself occasionally, we don't think about until we get to the end of the paper. But realistically, we should be thinking about managerial relevance and implications throughout the paper. Because in business, that really is where we are going. Eventually, this has to be meaningful in some way to the conduct of business in some way. And with that, I'll stop to get to perhaps another question.
Excellent, Saeed and Costa. Let's turn to some of our questions. We won't be able to address some of the remarks and questions here, but we will try to do so afterwards as well. So our colleague writes, could you provide some tips on initiating successful collaborative research? Very quickly, obviously, look around you in your research network, research team, collaborative team that Costa talked about, perhaps colleagues at other institutions who have similar research interests, and people, in fact, you have not met before, but perhaps you meet them at a conference, or these days you may approach them virtually and say that, look, I'm interested in this particular type of research that you're pursuing. I have some ideas, can we work together? I think you can certainly initiate collaborations like that too. Another colleague, Hariharan, asks, can we cite business magazines and journals? Definitely so. I mean, there's no reason why we can't. I tend to be a better reader of magazines like McKinsey Quarterly than academic journal articles. So I get my inspiration from them, and they're certainly acceptable as a reference. A colleague writes an interesting question about writing in third person. I'm now looking at, I don't know, where did that question go? Anyway, so what is, maybe you can provide, Saeed and Costa, whether the argument was, is writing in third person outmoded? I don't think so. There is a tradition, I think, in our discipline to write in the third person. In economics, maybe in other fields, it's not. They do a lot of first person. But in our field, I think third person is the mode, is the acceptable mode. Not necessarily to make it boring. Obviously, you have to make your reading a pleasant experience as well. But third person is the accustomed approach. Saeed and Costa, do you agree? Do you have any feelings?
Yeah, I think so. I concur with that, but I would add that the journals tend to have their own style as well. And I've had situations where I would have something in one format, and then they'll say, no, it has to be first person or third person, so that they would switch it back and forth. But I think, as Thomas suggested, most often it's the third person that is the common practice.
So a colleague writes, how far outside of your own research area do you usually venture? I do research in economics, but I developed a deep interest in psychology, regard myself a crossover artist. I think that's great. That's wonderful, because if you really look at the seminal pieces that we talked about today, one of the reasons why they became seminal and so impactful is that they brought new, fresh perspectives from other social sciences, political science, sociology, anthropology, psychology. There's so many examples of that. So definitely opening your blinders and becoming familiar with the themes, explanations, and theories in other social sciences will only enrich your writing, will provide more creativity, will provide, I think, better justification. I think will be a pleasant experience for your readership as well. If you can bring an explanation from social psychology to explain the behavior of emerging market consumers engaged in luxury consumption, for example. So that's definitely a good practice. Reading outside of your discipline, reading broadly, I think it's very, very important. Um, uh, there's a lot of questions here. So once a paper is rejected by a journal, it is recommended to resubmit the paper in the same journal, incorporating all the changes that were suggested by the editor. So I guess the decision to submit back to the journal versus try another journal. Costa and Said, what do you think about that? I mean,
I mean, oh, thank you, Tamer. Basically, when a paper is rejected by a journal, they don't want to see the same paper where authors have been trying to address reviewer comments. Basically, you may be able to submit something on the same topic, but not a substantially advanced manuscript based on the previous study. Of course, always, it's good news when we receive comments from reviewers, despite the fact that many of our manuscripts are going to get rejected because it's a process on the basis of which we learn a great deal. We should look at the comments with utmost care and attention and try to understand the underlying logic in the comments. And the focus of attention should be that we need to improve our project by taking account of what the reviewers and the editors have highlighted in their comments.
right.
I would add to that most leading and mid-level journals do not want to see the same paper again. And if we felt compelled, we thought we had a case that we could do this, I would suggest that contacting the editor with explanation and reasons and so on. And if he or she approves for a resubmission, I would go that route rather than surprise them, and then they'll eventually cross-check and find, and that doesn't look very good. So I think I would check with the editor first and go about it that way. But most journals don't want to see the same study, even if it's slightly improved or addressed with the comments that are attached.
And of course, you should never submit a paper that came back rejected from a journal to another journal without revising it, because you'll find that reviewers actually are on different editorial boards. So the same reviewer can be reviewing the same paper at two different journals. So you should definitely work on it, revise it before you submit it. After all, keep in mind that initially you write a paper for a small number of reviewers who are well known in the particular research stream. So keep those people in mind and think about anticipate potential objections. What would they say about your paper? So definitely that's important. So
if I could add, excuse me, Tamer.
Go ahead.
Yeah, if I could add to what Tomer said, is I think it's also important to put your shoes, your feet in, or put the shoes or the hat of the reviewer on. Reviewing is not a paid position. It provides somewhat of a stature. So it's a donated time. And papers can be tedious and difficult to review. And so, and the tendency on the review part, at least the training, is to lean towards finding mistakes or weaknesses in the paper. But they could also make mistakes. And if you feel that there is a huge mistake that's made in some cases, I think it may be appropriate to write a note to the editor and very nicely suggest that I think something was overlooked. But I wouldn't do that just as soon as I received the rejections. I would probably try to run it by some colleagues and others to see what the reaction is. And that avenue is open. But I think you have to really put yourself in the shoes of the reviewers as well.
Well, I see Hannah, which means our time is up. We try to keep these to an hour and to make it reasonable for folks to attend. Just some final thoughts. I think what we want to convey to our group here, certainly just as in teaching, there are skills that can be acquired for successful publishing. So you need to work on those skills. It needs to be practiced and practiced. You can learn from the masters as well as from your own experiences. Somebody said luck is the residual planning, preparation, and discipline. So you have to invest a lot of planning, a lot of preparation, a lot of dedicated work and discipline. Discipline and patience, I think, is very important. Finally, I think crafting manuscripts for publication should be rewarding in itself. Try to enjoy the process. You shouldn't do this under stress. You shouldn't overstress yourself because that will be anti-productive. So definitely take it with a positive outlook. Look at it with a positive orientation and try to enjoy the process.